It was in 1678 that an English woodcut pamphlet was published bearing the title The Mowing-Devil. The pamphlet tells the story of a farmer in Hertfordshire who, refusing to pay the price demanded by a laborer who mowed his field, swore he would rather the devil mowed it instead. That night, his field appeared to be in flames, and the next morning, the field was found to be perfectly mowed in a way that no mortal man was able to do. Many say that interstellar civilizations can be all around us and pop in and out our atmosphere at any time and at any wished coordination with the speed of light. Some even suggest that crop circles are the proof for these visitations. Is the human species dealing with an interstellar civilization presenting themselves as intelligent plasmas? A force of nature that is not fully understood, but have the ability of sending and receiving information. What is it that they find so interesting on our planet? Who create these extraordinary mysteries in the field, and why? Could the complex geometric design of a crop circle be the visible result of time travelers using wormholes? I am your host, Marianne van Driel, and you are listening to The Next Truth, where science and myth meet. And this week I'm speaking with the director of the non-profit Institute for Resonance in Boulder, Colorado, Dr. Simeon Hein, about how we can learn the skills of remote viewing and the mysteries of vast, complex crop circles that materialize overnight. Dr. Hein, welcome to the show of The Next Truth, where science and myth meet. As I just mentioned in your intro, you are the director of the non-profit Institute for Resonance. What do I have to think about an Institute for Resonance? Where is this institute aiming its scientific arrows towards?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. I appreciate it. Yeah, a number of years ago, I got involved with the topic of remote viewing. I studied it. I had just finished graduate school a few years ago. I had completed my PhD in sociology, and I had been a statistics professor. And I came across these topics that I couldn't fit in to any of the scientific training I had received before. I didn't have any preparation for these topics, but I could see from the evidence and the data that these were real phenomena. And they didn't fit anywhere into our existing scientific paradigms in an easy way. So I found that I had to create a new way of looking at the phenomena, the world around us, the experiences we have, to try to come up with a coherent explanation for what may be behind some of these things that I had experienced, other people had experienced, and now there's, a good body of scientific literature for after about 100 years. And to me, it seemed that there were some fundamental scientific principles that hadn't really been studied very much, the science of resonance. And what we're talking about here are phenomena that exhibit non-locality. They may not operate in a linear way in terms of time, and they may exhibit a lot of non-Newtonian characteristics, which simply don't have an easy place to fit within the accepted paradigms that we all work within. And that's why I started my own nonprofit institute and publishing company.
So what you are saying is that you are exploring or researching the what people call the paranormal things, the telepathy, the communication between.
Right.
I believe that you mentioned between plants and humans. Is that correct?
Not one of the things I've particularly focused on it, but that type of interaction would fall within the same subject matter. Yeah, I mean, I came across the topics of remote viewing, precognition, telepathy. Some of the things, you talked about these with Dean Radin not too long ago in one of your podcasts. And there are many other phenomena that also fall within that kind of rubric, what you're calling paranormal. Calling it paranormal doesn't really tell us anything about what it is. It just means it doesn't fit within ordinary perception.
How do we call it? If we cannot or should not call it paranormal, how do you think that we should call it?
We should just call it science. I mean, any phenomena that you and I deal with, so many things we deal with every day, Maria, technology, science, were at one time considered supernatural or paranormal. That's just a label that we give to things that we know are real, but we can't explain easily. And so we wouldn't want to call computers and light bulbs paranormal, would we? That would just seem silly nowadays.
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
People did. There was a time when people did. And there was a time where you could be burnt at the stake for even having this type of conversation that we're talking about. But then after many years, it just becomes seen as ordinary with a scientific explanation. I mean, consider the Wright brothers, who were ridiculed for many years, even by the leading newspapers, long after they had been flying, just because it seemed so hard to accept. Manned space travel, just ordinary things in our lives now, like record players were at one time considered to be very strange, and electricity, magnetism. Maria, there was a time when vacuums, simple vacuums within glass, were considered supernatural.
How serious?
Yeah, because Aristotle had said there's no such thing as a vacuum, and Aristotle had said there's nothing that changes beyond the orbit of the Earth. Beyond the orbit of the moon, that was considered an area that's static, completely static. And there was considered to be no movement or activity beyond the moon. And anything that happened that didn't conform to Aristotle's ideas were completely ridiculed and considered to be supernatural. Dean Radin mentioned to you the other day, meteorites were considered to be a total hoax. But even things on Earth, like vacuum spaces, were considered to be supernatural because they just didn't fit. So anything supernatural, paranormal, is simply something that we're not comfortable with yet. Now, it doesn't mean it's necessarily real, but when you do have a lot of data for these topics that we're about to talk about, then you need to consider, why would we resist talking about them? Why do we want to label them with that sort of metaphysical baggage, when it simply could be due to scientific phenomena that are not well understood? And do we want to fall into that same pattern of just labeling everything that's beyond an easy way to explain as being supernatural, paranormal, or it's a hoax, or it's impossible? Or do we want to take a look at some of these? Now, something like remote viewing has about 100 years of data behind it. Good data. We don't have to go through all of it like you did with Dean Radin the other day, but so many studies show that we have this sort of precognitive ability, as I think Dean called it presentience, and other people like Darrell Bem from Cornell University have studied this phenomena rigorously to a point where it's highly statistically significant. Not easy to explain how you and I can get an advanced perception of something that hasn't technically happened yet in our reality, but the data shows that's what's going on. And that's the same principle behind something like remote viewing, as I call it, resonant viewing. There's some sort of feedback coming from what we call the future. And that suggests that time is not as linear as we've been led to believe.
Well, why do you call it? Because you mentioned several times now remote viewing, and everybody understands this term as seeing from a distance what is happening on a distance in in different time eras. But you say resonance viewing?
Yeah, sure.
What is the difference there in
Well,
there?
remote viewing, you have to understand, is a term that was created by Swan in the interests of getting funding from the U.S. government to study this phenomena. The government was concerned that the Soviet Union had a psychic research program going, that they were already doing this, and they considered it to be a potential weapon that could be used against the United States. And they were interested in studying it, and Ingo had to kind of come up with a terminology that would sound kind of sexy and interesting. And remote viewing kind of almost sounds like satellite imagery, right? It doesn't sound controversial. It doesn't sound like ESP. It doesn't sound like a seance or like channeling, which would have some sort of baggage associated with it.
Now you mention it. It does have a bit of a background sound in military.
It does. It does. Yeah. Remote viewing, it sounds kind of innocuous, like maybe you have just a very good telescope or very strong binoculars.
It sounds less spooky.
It doesn't sound spooky. Similarly, this has happened recently when the Department of Defense has started calling UFOs UAPs.
I heard that.
Aerial phenomena. It doesn't quite have the baggage. And when you're attempting to get something that's acceptable to funding agencies, you want to use kind of a neutral language. And so they didn't call this precognition or ESP or telepathy, or they call it remote viewing. But the thing is, when you do remote viewing, you realize one thing: the information isn't remote. You're perceiving it right here. You're not doing astral travel, at least in my view. You're not going somewhere else. You're sitting in your chair with a piece of paper and a pen, and you're describing impressions you're getting here. So maybe it's not remote. The analogy being there to radios. We're all familiar in the olden days, before we had the internet, that we would tune everything in through radio or TV receivers with a tuning knob. Yeah. And you're getting the information from a station that's broadcasting at a distance, but the energy and the information is right here. It's getting picked up by the antenna. So it's not really remote in that sense, because the physics of electricity and magnetism mean that the wave propagates throughout space, and it's actually in your space too. So it's not technically really remote. And it's not.
So in a way, this is bending time and space in a natural manner.
I would say so. I would say it's just using something that nature already had there that we just didn't know consciously that it existed. Everybody's had the experience or know somebody where they had an intuitive feeling about a relative or a person or a place that they just knew they should call someone in their family, or they felt like they should take a different route to work in the morning because they didn't know why, but they just took a different turn, only later to find out there was a traffic jam. And this is before the days, obviously, where we had mapping programs on our phones that showed us the traffic jams ahead of time. But people have had that experience, said, I don't know how I knew this, but I just felt like I should call Aunt Sally. And I found out that someone in the family had a medical emergency. And, I didn't know how I knew this, but I just picked up the phone and called her.
That isn't the typical thing from remote viewing. In my opinion, remote viewing is only by pictures. And if you have this sense that you have to phone somebody or have to go somewhere, I think that is more in the range of telepathy more, and not with viewing, not with seeing.
Right, but my point is that I think it's the same phenomena. We're just giving it labels. That intuitive sense that can be very accurate of knowing something at a distance, or having a precognitive dream about some event that's going to happen in your life, and you make a decision to do something differently because of that strong dream you had. I would argue those are all the same phenomena. We've given them different labels, because when you do so-called remote viewing, quote unquote, it isn't viewing. That's the name it was given, but a lot of people don't get visual images. And I'll tell you something. Yeah, it's perceiving, because even the visual images are very faint. And you could just get a feeling of a color or a smell or a size or a shape, but you didn't see it. It's just a kind of a feeling about it, in the similar way that you had a feeling about something happening in your family or in your life or in some way. So my point is that it's probably the same principle at work here. It has survival value, and nature built it into us to be multidimensional, to perceive more than our physical senses. And because the information comes in a very broad way, it's more like a resonant type of perception. And again, using the radio analogy, I'm not saying it's an electromagnetic signal like a radio wave, but it's sort of like that, because you're getting information from something that's not physically next to you, but you're describing it in real time or even into the future accurately. And that must mean that that thing or place or event already exists somewhere, and somehow you're picking up on it. Upton Sinclair wrote that book called Mental Radio, and it's a good analogy. I don't think it's literally like a radio, but at a quantum level, what does quantum mechanics tell us? Is that everything has an energy and a frequency. I mean, that's really what Einstein and Max Planck were really working with, the people that kind of got the whole quantum movement, the idea that we needed to look at things non-classically. Those guys said that everything is energy and frequency. And if that's true, there seems to be some aspect of you and me that can pick up on those energies and frequencies without it really moving in the intervening space.
Remote viewing as a skill that is speaking of looking into interdimensional realms, or in geometric design of the universe. You say, you state in several YouTube videos that you giving classes in remote viewing, how the people can learn this skill. How is that working? Because I cannot make a picture in my mind about how somebody can learn, something that is in the region of the paranormal.
Well, thanks for asking. I'll give you an idea of how it works. It's not learning to do something new. It's learning to get rid of the interference of the conscious mind.
Okay.
If it's an innate ability to experience this phenomena, which I'm talking about, which I don't ask you to believe in without your own experience. I didn't believe in it either before I took a week-long class in it. It was the results of the class that convinced me that something must be going on that I didn't logically understand, or I wouldn't be able to accurately sketch a picture that I wouldn't see for half an hour, right? And walk around the sites and get accurate information from targets, pictures that you wouldn't see for an hour, 2 hours later. The way you do it is you retrain your mind not to edit anything out. It's easier to say than it is to do. But if this is really a natural ability that we all have, it's not like learning to do it. It's learning how to stop interfering with something that's already there. These sort of telepathic precognitive signals, whatever you'd like to call them. And keep in mind, all these words we use have a lot of associations with them that may or may not be accurate. Even the idea that you're using of telepathy, the idea of mind-to-mind interaction, reading someone's mind, that may not exist at all. We just think of it that way. Imagine, Maria, that you and I are tuned to the same radio station right now. Would we be receiving the information from that radio station? We would be having the same thoughts in our mind, but we're not talking mind to mind. We're picking up the same frequency. Again, it's kind of a resonant idea. So
telepathy can be more seen as more people at the same time receiving an external frequency,
being on the same frequency, just like tuning forks. I'm sure you've seen the experiment. I wish I had them here right now. If you have two tuning forks and you hit one of the tuning forks, the other tuning forks in the room will start to vibrate. And it's not that they're reading each other's mind. They're at the same frequency, and frequencies are sort of omnipresent throughout our universe. The more tuning forks you add, interestingly enough, when you add more tuning forks to the same room in that same space with the original tuning forks, does the volume decrease as you add more tuning forks in? It doesn't. It actually increases because the energy is coming from the universe itself. You've disturbed the electromagnetic field and it responds by pushing back, and it pushes back with an infinite amount of energy. And that's one of the things that make it a little easier to understand how it's possible for you to see something at a distance, is you're not using your own energy. You're receiving signals in the same way that a radio can work, or tuning forks. When you're at the same frequency, you're going to start spontaneously receiving what's ever in that frequency. You know, I've heard some funny stories once, more than once, about musicians on stage accidentally picking up the police broadcasts in the local area through their wind instrument, through their saxophone or something. Just something about the reed or the mechanism in that instrument tuned into exactly the frequency of a local police cruiser, and they'll be on stage and they'll all of a sudden a radio broadcast will come out through their instrument. Because
okay, serious, that happened before?
Seriously happening, yeah.
Okay, I can imagine that the audience then goes, oh my God, there's a ghost. No?
It seems that way to us because that's our training. You know, when I was a kid, I learned how to build electronic equipment and something called a crystal radio.
Yes.
Now, the amazing thing to me about a crystal radio, it was one of the early radios from over 100 years ago, before batteries were invented. You could get an accurate radio signal from a crystal, and it would tune into your local AM radio stations with no battery. You could hear it in an earpiece. The radio signal was enough to get the background electromagnetic field of the universe to vibrate, to actually be able to hear it right in your earpiece with no other electronics, which tells us that the universe itself is like an active signal transceiver. No, very little technology required, and it's already built into us. So to get back to your question, how do you...
I was wanting to ask that.
Yeah, no, I'm talking around your question, but the way you teach people to do it is you teach them to stop interfering with these very subtle signals. The RV signal, Maria, and ask anyone who's involved in this area, don't take my word for it, it's often very faint. And we're good at pushing it away because our talking mind, our left brain, is very strong. It's very loud. And our physical senses have to be loud so that if there's a jaguar in front of you that's about to pounce on you, or even these days, a mountain lion, as sometimes happens in the United States, your senses are going to start warning you, and you need to pay attention to that. It's in front of you. And this is why our physical senses are a lot stronger than our subtle senses. But the signal is there. And I think all the decades of research into this area show statistically that it is there. The Princeton, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab and others that did decades of testing on these sort of phenomena. It's a subtle phenomena, but it's there. And you train people to do this by teaching them to stop interfering with their own subtle perceptions and perceive very subtle impressions that are sort of at the back of your mind. That's my experience of it. And when you write them down and say, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but we'll find out when the session's over, and you look at the target, you'll be surprised that you get more than you should if you were just guessing.
More than you want, probably, from somebody. Now, all this mind-dazzling, complex, well, things happening in the mind, what influenced you to research this? I mean, one day you wake up and say, okay, well, let's research the frequencies and the waves and the quantum worlds from the universe and how that it is affecting on people and on the mind. So what influenced you to research this?
Well, it was the weight of the evidence. I mean, I did have a PhD already when I started studying these topics. And if you're an honest person and you start coming across evidence that may not agree with your belief systems, but nonetheless, you start doing some research and you say, you know, these are well-conducted studies. It's coming to a conclusion that I haven't thought about before. You have to be honest with yourself and say maybe your worldview was incorrect before. Maybe there's something going on that nobody told you about. Is it possible that there are things going on in the world that you weren't told about in school, all the way through graduate school? That even though you think you're a smarty pants and that you have a PhD in a certain subject area and you know what's going on, maybe you don't know what's going on. And isn't that what all your academic training told you the whole time, is to pay attention to the evidence, not your prior existing belief systems? And that even though the conclusion may not be even something you're comfortable with, does the weight of the evidence lead you to believe that this phenomena is real? And you have to, when you look at all of this evidence, and it just gets better all the time because the studies are more controlled. It's like a lot of these phenomena, there's just more and more evidence for them. You have to say, I don't know how this works, but the evidence shows that a person can sit down and accurately describe a target that they won't actually consciously know about for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours later, maybe even a week later, because people have done this sort of thing with the stock market, with commodity pricing, and have accurately predicted it a week ahead of time, week after week for a decade. Well beyond the odds of what you would expect if they're just guessing. Again, it's more evidence that you have this sort of precognitive ability. Now, let me say one thing though. I did have an experience as a teenager with my mom seeing a UFO in the Florida Everglades. She was a bird watcher. She loved nature. She would take me out on walks all the time. Even when I grew up in New York City, she would take me to Central Park every day as a toddler. So, to walk around the rocks and the trees and the lawn out there. Well, we went down to the Everglades in the mid-'70s, and there was an object that came over us that I thought had to be the moon. It was so bright and so big, but it was moving, and it's right over us. We had binoculars. We could see it. And the very interesting thing is we went to a ranger talk a couple hours later. In the national park system in the U.S., there are rangers who give a talk every night at, at kind of a little outdoor setting where you go for a talk to learn about the park. And the first thing she said is, did anyone see anything interesting today? And so we raised our hands. He said, we saw a UFO. And she said, well, that's interesting. Did anybody else see anything interesting today? She didn't want to hear about it. And to my little 12-year-old mind, I thought, whoa, wait a minute. My mom and I both saw something with binoculars with lights on it. It's round. It's unexplainable to my 12-year-old mind. My mom said it had to be a UFO. It's nothing. We never saw anything like it before. And here, some authority figure, for me, the park ranger, representing all of authority, says, who cares? So even early on, I kind of realized that maybe new evidence is difficult to accept. So basically, to answer your question, it's the weight of the evidence. I took a class in 1996 at the Farsight Institute in Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't think I would have any ability, but I was wrong. I could describe target pictures with more accuracy than you would expect, and everyone else in the class had the same results. And then I realized, is it possible that there's another principle by which information is flowing between you and me and the environment that we science has never talked about adequately, what people call psi phenomena? And the more I looked into it, the more I saw there were good studies, there was a lot of evidence, there was all the work of Targ and Puthoff and many others before me who had looked at this. And yet, even though I had a subscription to Science magazine since 1990, nobody had ever talked about this. There was no articles on psi phenomena. Hal Puthoff did have I think Targ and Puthoff did have an article in Science sometime in the 80s before I subscribed. But you didn't read about it very much. But when I looked at the evidence, the statistical significance was way beyond any pharmaceutical drug anyone's ever taken, or even aspirin for that matter. The significance of the effect of your ability to perceive future events and non-local information, even though it's not a very strong effect, it's a very statistically significant effect. It's very consistent. And so I just started going to that, and then you get involved in more topics because people think, well, if he's crazy enough to believe in RV, maybe he'll be interested in my story about X, Y, or Z. Take your pick. UFOs, Bigfoot, poltergeists, precognitive dreams, crop circles. You begin to wonder, Maria, Are there other topics that science, formal science, the science you read in Nature or Science magazines, is there something beyond that that is actually happening that is not being written about because there's a stigma attached to it? Now, as a sociologist, I realized, wow, now we're really getting to something interesting. There's a whole level of scientific phenomena that people have dedicated their lives to. Think Nikola Tesla and many others who are not household words. Actually, they've demonstrated something important, but we don't consider it real. And that's when I started going off and looking for more evidence of these phenomena with, good scientific evidence and so forth, and it exists. It's just that there's stigma attached to certain topics. We call it paranormal, supernatural, and people get afraid of it. But it could just have very fundamental scientific explanations.
Crop circles, as I just mentioned, that is one of your interests, I believe.
Yes.
So what are crop circles? I mentioned in the intro that it could be that it is an interstellar civilization presenting themselves as plasmas or intelligent plasmas, or perhaps it is time travelers using wormholes, and that the geometric formation of a crop circle is the visual end result or results from using those wormholes. What are crop circles?
Well, we should always remember Albert Einstein's advice that things should be simplified as much as possible, but no simpler. Yes. So we never need to look beyond common explanations if they explain what we see from the evidence. We don't need to invent extra complicated ideas if we can find other explanations that are more common sense and something that is more similar to what we've experienced so far. These particular topics don't have an easy, obvious explanation. I think if you look at them from a quantum point of view, and the way I look at it right now, more from a multidimensional parallel reality point of view, you actually can see that they're not that complicated. But I'm not going to insist you believe in that. It does take some time for society to eventually realize there's not a lot of cogs and gears spinning around to the planets with epicycles and Ptolemy's explanations of all these very complicated motions of the planet. There's just something called gravity, and we're not the center, the sun is, and then it's all very simple. So we're all looking for that sort of simplicity. Now, having said that, going to crop circles, the same sort of thing applied. In the RV class I took in '96, the instructor gave us a picture of a crop circle. Now, Maria, I had just come out of graduate school. I had been an assistant professor. I never heard of a crop circle before in my life. I didn't even know what I was looking at when I saw the feedback of this pattern in the wheat that had been done in the UK in 1996. This one was at Windmill Hill. It was a spiral shape. These crop circles are patterns that have been appearing in grain crops for a long time. And they started there were a lot more of them in the 80s and 90s, especially in the UK, occasionally in the rest of Europe too. Mm-hmm. Now, I really wanted to know what these were because I just got curious looking at the picture in the feedback for my RV session. And so I actually started going to UFO conferences after taking the RV class because I realized I had met witnesses who had worked for the government that said that UFOs were actually real and unexplainable. People had worked for NASA, had come and taken the RV class, and they told me in private conversation that NASA had a lot of information they weren't sharing. And I began to get more curious in the whole topic of UFOs. So I went to a conference not knowing what to expect. I thought maybe everyone would be wearing Vulcan ears. It'd be like a Star Trek fan conference. But I actually found a lot of serious presentations and researchers who actually had evidence. Now, one of them was a guy, Ron Russell, who said, we don't know exactly what these crop circles are, how they're made, or what their purpose is, but I'm giving tours to the UK. You can come with me, and we'll go explore them ourselves and see what we get. So I just went over there in '97, and that's how I got interested in the topic. Now, what I did find is there immediately, I heard very credible stories of people saying that their cameras and batteries had stopped working in and around crop circles. And I saw it that year with Ron Russell's Sony camera. We went into a crop formation in wheat. It was near Andover, Danebury Hillfort, as it was called, Andover, UK. And he put his camera down on the crop circle to take a drink of water or something, and it stopped working. And when we touched it, it was hot to the touch.
That sounds like as if there's still present a kind of magnetic pulse.
Yeah, there's some sort of energy going on. Yeah, and it had melted. His inside of his camera had melted as soon as he put it down on the crop circle, the solder joints. Sony had to resolder the power supply. And I thought, well, that's just weird. And I heard other people talk about this. So this was evidence for me, Maria, that something was happening in the crop circle. Now, and we had static meters, and we started measuring static charge. We found there was a lot of static electricity around these crop circles, and there was electromagnetic phenomena. People would have their compasses start spinning around, things like that. And initially, I thought, there was no one identified who could make these. They were really big. It would take a long time to do. But lo and behold, in the year 2000, I was approached by Matt Williams, a confessed circle maker, a researcher initially, but a confessed circle maker. And he invited me to see some made in the daytime that had been paid for, where the farmer had been paid. I didn't think they could do anything, but they did produce in the daytime some pretty good looking formations. And I measured it, and it had some static charges and some electromagnetic effects that were not immediately easy to explain. And then I was introduced to another group that took me out at night to see how they did it at night. Again, I was skeptical of this as I was of RV. I thought, no way people could do this. These are big patterns. We all know this is done by extraterrestrials or time travelers. But I did find that there were teams of people in Wiltshire going out at night, artists. You're an artist. These were artists too. They loved patterns, they loved shape, they loved geometry, and they loved a big canvas, a wheat field, where they didn't ask permission. They'd go in with these very well-designed plans, very well-designed plans of action, and create these patterns overnight. They didn't say that they had always been doing them. These were young people, younger people. They hadn't been doing them for more than a few years. I don't know who did them in the past. I've talked to witnesses that have seen flying discs flatten crops. There's no doubt that the energy around UFOs and flying saucers does affect wheat and other grain crops. It's been seen here in the US and other countries, the Tully saucer nests in Australia. But these were not the ones made by UFOs. These were artists imitating the ones made by UFOs. And the big surprise was even the ones they made created weird electromagnetic effects. And that's people would have precognitive experiences in these circles sometimes where they would see something that might show up the next day and draw it ahead of time. And there it would be like almost like they remote viewed the crop circle ahead of time. Even the circle makers told me that they would sometimes feel compelled to go out and make shapes only to find that there was a group nearby meditating on that shape that they didn't even know about. So I started to see some interrelation between RV and crop circles and the general topic of UFOs. And again, it seemed to me that there was something about the resonance of the shape, the geometry of the crop circle that was creating very challenging to explain electromagnetic effects.
So this shape, this geometric shape, as you explain it in this way, is speaking of a visible form of the frequency of, let's say, a group of people meditating, or perhaps one person. That this is the visible shape of this person's frequency.
That's right. It's kind of like a Fourier, as they call the Fourier transform. It's a visual representation of the energy of that system. And there's a whole field created around it called Cymatics from Dr. Hans Jenny from Switzerland. You've seen the cymatic videos where you broadcast a frequency into a metal plate that has sand on it, or lycopodium dust, and it forms these very coherent geometric patterns. And it has
its own form, its own shape. Yes.
Right. And this was initially discovered by the German physicist Ernst Friedrich Florenz Chladni in the 1700s, I believe. He went around Europe with a violin bow and a metal plate, and he would show audiences. He's known as the father of acoustics. Curiously enough, he's also the one that argued for extraterrestrial origin of meteorites. He was the one that said they were coming from the sky. No one else believed it until he went out with another researcher in France, and they looked, and we were able to show that these were extraterrestrial in origin. But before that, he was interested in what we call cymatics. He created these waveforms, and the mathematicians at the time were able to work out the mathematics behind waves. But this became the basis for Schrodinger's wave function in quantum mechanics. It wasn't actually invented by Schrodinger. It was invented by Chladni, at least in a very simple form. You had to work around multiple electrons in an atom, but for a one-atom system, Chladni had already worked on it and created the waveforms that we call cymatics. So that's the idea, is that shapes, it's a quantum idea now. Shapes have energy. Energy creates shapes. And that's what we're seeing in crop circles. It doesn't even matter if you and I go out and make it, Maria. It's going to have an energy that we may not even have intended. It's an unintended consequence of the formation, is that it's creating an electromagnetic disturbance. And interestingly enough, at a microscopic scale, if you look at crop circle shapes, at a microscopic scale in terms of the energy structure of any sort of atomic or crystalline system, it looks very similar to the shapes of crop circles. And in those environments, it creates things like superconductivity, other kind of exotic quantum effects. So this is still a mystery, but is there something about those shapes that's creating a nonlinear interaction with the environment, which might explain why we have cameras stop working, batteries, electronic devices of all types. I've heard many stories of this, and I put it on YouTube, the ones I've been able to film when I was there when it happened, if my camera wasn't affected, of people walking in with brand new cameras only to have them stop working immediately as soon as they got in the area of the crop circle.
So if these formations in crop circles could have a source from the human mind resonating, then I suddenly understand why I find certain people very complex. Okay, but your book, Black Swan Ghost, a sociologist encounters witness to explain aerial craft, their occupants, and other elements of the universe. Is your book also discussing crop circles and the geometric designs and the resonance that is in there?
Not directly. I'm more focused on people who've been around crop circles that have experienced UFOs or visitors, whoever they are. Maybe they're extraterrestrial. Being involved in the topics of RV and crop circles, I came across experiencers, people that had experienced an interaction with a flying disc, a UFO, or some other unexplained aerial phenomena, sometimes with occupants, sometimes not. There were too many of these witnesses to ignore, and I realized I needed to write another book just about the UFO encounter phenomena itself. There's something in our minds, Maria, that want to separate topics into separate categories. It's how we've been trained. It's how the Western scientific tradition works. But there's a lot of similarities between these phenomena, as the researcher Jacques Vallée has pointed out many times. People who've had these UFO experiences sometimes have precognitive experiences even before their encounter, or after their encounter, they just feel like they may have abilities that they never had before. Or they start experiencing things around their environment in their home that they've never experienced before. And I did find this from my interviews with Black Swan Ghost witnesses, and I'm still interviewing new people even to this day, this is a real phenomena. There's many people that have experienced the UFO phenomena, even around crop circles. I will tell you honestly that some of the crop circle makers, the The ones we still haven't identified by name, because obviously it's not legal to go out into a farmer's field and start pushing their crops down with boards. I mean, it's considered vandalization of the crops, at least in the UK.
Yes.
You could get fined for it. It's a minor crime, but it's still a crime to mess around with someone's crops. You're not removing it, but you're pushing them around, and that's considered a type of vandalism.
Yes.
But even the circle makers told me they've seen things over the circles when they're making them, low, hovering over them, triangular objects, balls of light, other phenomena that are kind of hard to explain. And so
Don't you think when a group of people is that focused on creating their form of art, regardless what the source is, that is creating a kind of mass hysteria in a positive manner, and thus is people are resonance, like the forks that you were the sound forks that you were talking about earlier, that they are vibrating to each other, and then a kind of illusion is created in the mind, and that some of these, what people experience hovering over a crop circle while they are making it, that this is a possible explanation for what they are seeing.
yes, and that is something you need to consider. There's always the possibility of mass hallucination. This is well documented, mass hysteria. But in some cases, we have witnesses far away or on the nearby road who saw the same phenomena that they did, who never even talked to them. In the case of, there was an incident over Silbury Hill that I had a group of witnesses camping on Silbury Hill telling me about seeing objects coming down from the field right across from Silbury Hill, an ancient area known as the West Kennet Long Barrow. You know, these are all ancient structures, the West Kennet Long Barrow being 10,000 years old, and Silbury Hill, you know, the largest man-made earth mound in Europe is about 5,000 years old. Okay, there was these people I interviewed, Paul and Sonia, in the book. I mean, they contacted me later, having heard me on an interview, and told me their story. And lo and behold, there were other witnesses. One parked in the lay-by, as it's called there, on the A4 near Silbury Hill, that saw the same objects moving around the hill that they saw. And a third witness, Paul Vigay, who's no longer with us, he passed on a number of years ago. He was a crop circle researcher. I had heard him talk about an event he had seen near Silbury Hill on a certain date. It happened to be the exact same thing that Paul and Sonia were telling me about. They never talked to Paul. He never talked to them, but I had heard about this in the late 90s, and here I'm talking to Paul and Sonia, and they said, you know, there was a car that came along, and this ball of light came down from one of these objects and followed the car.
Oh.
Well, Paul had talked about this years before. I'm just mentioning this as you can have multiple witnesses to these phenomena that have never talked to each other. In that case, the mass hallucination doesn't make sense anymore, because these are people that don't even know each other. They're seeing the same event from different vantage points, and we can let that sort of common sense explanation go. It's not explaining what's happening. These people are really seeing some luminous phenomena that's very challenging to explain.
Perhaps a ball of lightning, a very tiny ball of lightning that is there on broad daylight, perhaps, or on a clear sky. I don't know. I have no experience in researching crop circles yet, but I think I will do so.
But let me answer your question though. Yes, these could have a natural explanation. They could be balls of light. There's a researcher, Bob Grenier, in Czechoslovakia, who works for the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. It's to carry on the work of Fleischmann and Pons in cold fusion. And he's done a lot of work in ball lightning. And what we've learned from him is that ball lightning can exist at a microscopic state and produce what we call cold fusion. Yes, really, it's really real. It can be large enough for people to see. And it can persist for a while. The thing about that, and the Ministry of Defense used ball lightning in their Condign report. that they had as a declassified report, I believe, from the early 2000s, where they were attempting to explain UFOs, and they used the ball of light explanation. The thing about it is, some of these objects seem solid. They seem like structured craft. There can be groups of them. There is a crossover, and this is why it's so challenging, Maria, just before we get to your next question. There's a crossover between these phenomena, and we don't know exactly why, but balls of light are associated with UFOs. Balls of light are associated with Bigfoot sightings. I don't know why, but people see balls of light and then they see a Bigfoot emerge from the ball of light and it leaves footprints. You can see the cast. Balls of light have even been associated with remote viewing sessions of people I've known. I wrote about it in Opening Minds. People have seen balls of. We don't know exactly what the crossover is. Again, it's reliable enough to show us that there's some connection between these phenomena, but we can't simply say that UFOs are ball lightning. I think that's a stretch. But yes, there can be sometimes natural explanations. True. Yes. So thanks for bringing that up.
People experiencing these moments, regardless if that's in a group or that they are alone at that moment, you say also that these people do not really have a platform or have a place to go to explain and tell about
Yes.
their experiences or hear from others that they have this similar
Yes.
experiences. You say you probably have a solution for that or have already solved that problem, that people do not have the fear to talk about what they have seen or experienced.
Well,
Right?
I don't know if I have the solution, but I do know, and thanks for bringing that up. That's a very important point, and I do appreciate you. That was the point of the book Black Swan Ghosts. When you have rare events that are not really considered socially acceptable or people could be ridiculed for, they won't talk about it. They will maybe not even talk to their spouse about it. Now, my grandparents were refugees from Nazi Germany, and it took a couple days to spend with my grandmother before she passed on in the 80s to get an oral history of what it was like to live in Nazi Germany. There was a sense of fear that came over people, especially Jewish people, but other people too. If you didn't fit in with the Nazi regime, you were gradually turned into a second-class citizen, a little bit at a time, law by law, and eventually many were sent to concentration camps. And it's not something that's easy to talk about because it's so unpleasant. And it seems to me that there's a similarity with any phenomena that is not considered socially acceptable. Now it's considered acceptable for victims of Nazi Germany to talk about it, to get compensation. But that took a long time. And there were many years where I visited Germany several times doing research, working at the Goethe Institute, learning German. There was a time when people even in Germany didn't talk about it for a long time. And I imagine if you were in one of those towns where there was a concentration camp, you would have just turned the other way and pretended you didn't know what's going on. The UFO situation
was a different time, yes.
Yeah, in a different time. And it can take a while to feel that it's okay to talk about it again. The UFO situation isn't as extreme as that, but what I found is that people that have experienced these phenomena fear that they're going to lose economic benefits, that they're going to be hurt in some way. They could lose, if they had worked for the government, they could lose their retirement benefits and so forth. And to this day, they still don't want to come forward with some of the best evidence that I've seen. If you feel that there's a stigma attached to the topic, and this is my contribution as a sociologist speaking, you won't get the full truth about the topic. There was a time in the US where child abuse wasn't considered real before 1965. It was not a legitimate diagnosis for doctors to say that a child had their bone broken. It was it was too charged. It was too controversial. And it took a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1965 for doctors and psychologists and social workers to come together and say, yes, these children are not falling out of trees. They're not being beaten up by the neighborhood bully. They're being beaten by their parents. That was very hard for anyone to accept. But from that point on, it became real. We're seeing a similar thing going on right now with UFOs, with congressional hearings so far to this date classified about naval encounters with these objects. The Navy has been very concerned for about 2 decades now, apparently, at least, with these objects interfering with their training exercises. And they finally come forward. They issued a statement last year saying they're not going to penalize naval pilots for telling their stories. But Maria, how many other people are out there that haven't heard that from the Navy, that didn't work for the Navy, that still don't feel like they can go to their neighbor and at a party when we have parties again after COVID and say, I saw this.
So.
Yeah, I saw this thing. It's something that's very hard for people to talk about. And that's what I learned from Black Swan Ghosts and doing that book. And to this day, there are very good witnesses out there. We haven't heard from them. There is just a stigma attached to the topic. And it's also RV, people with precognitive experiences, people experiencing unexplainable animals, what we call in English cryptids, these animals that are very strange, Bigfoot being one of them. Lots of sightings, similar types of experiences, but many people don't feel comfortable making it publicly known that they've experienced this. And the reason I'm involved in these topics is people feel they talk to me because I published books about it. I'm non-judgmental and I'm open to the evidence. And this is why you get involved with these different topics. And then you begin to realize, is our worldview complete? Or are there many phenomena that have been going on for a long time? What we call hidden events in sociology, hidden events that haven't been publicly talked about yet. I think UFOs are one of them just because it's starting to come out. I mean, it's the military that's talking about it. So eventually the truth does come out after a while, and our scientific paradigms change, and it takes people in the positions of authority to say, it's okay to talk about it. What's your story? That doesn't mean we know what the explanation is, but at least the evidence can come out.
So people can come to you, for instance, to explain their experience or just to talk about what they have.
They do. I get contacted by people in YouTube, sometimes in the comment section. I had an individual named David Noble Whitecrow who had never told his story. He worked during Operation Dominique, which was the nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean by the U.S. and its allies in the 60s, late 50s and 60s. They were testing nuclear weapons before they put them into missiles. It's during the Cold War. They had to test these somewhere, and they obliterated whole islands and places to make sure that these worked. There were numerous tests. Well, he came forward, and I interviewed him. I have 8 interviews with him now on my YouTube channel. And he told us of all these he served in the Navy, on the Nimitz, on other ships, observing these nuclear tests. And he said there was lots of UFO activity around them, that there was even equipment mounted on these naval ships to get better readings of these objects, get better detection of these objects, even in the 60s. And so you wonder how many people are out there like David who were told not to talk about it back then, who signed something, a non-disclosure agreement, never to talk about it again, for whatever reason that the military felt it was important. And I think there are many.
Now, I'm not saying that UFOs are the woo-woo stuff or that it is not real. But perhaps, because you're saying, like this story of this man was in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s?
Yes.
What if, and I'm just playing the devil's advocate here, what if that, for instance, what we now know and are so familiar with is drones, and that in that period, these drones in the beginning state that were already flying, only we haven't heard about it yet in the 50s, 60s, but still they probably might be there at that moment observing from higher altitude how a nuclear explosion is taking place, is happening. It's just to record it. What we know today, and we do not even lift our eyebrows anymore when a drone is passing by. So, okay, yeah, that's a drone from the neighbor's kids. Could be.
No doubt. It's a very valid question, and this is a discussion we're having in the United States quite vigorously right now. Are some of these objects previously classified black budget technology? It doesn't seem like that explains what people are experiencing. We've had high-level people come forward from the Defense Department and the other intel agencies recently who've retired to come forward to say that this is a real headache for the military and the U.S. government, these objects. They have said categorically, these are not ours. We know everything the U.S. has. We don't think any other country has completely leapfrogged us, though we can't completely rule that out. Maybe some small country has made a huge leap in technology, and these could be their objects even decades ago. But if we look at the experiences of some of these witnesses, another individual I interviewed, I met in my area here, Gary, who worked as a missile security guard. He was actually burnt by a UFO that he was sent out to investigate by his unit in the Air Force at Minot, North Dakota. Now, this has happened to many other missile security guards and launch control officers who've had their missiles go down. So the reason we don't believe it's drones or anything like that is it's attacking our own military equipment. It doesn't seem like something as critical and dangerous as nuclear weapons that you would be tampering with from your own government. That just seems beyond what anyone considers to be a reasonable explanation. And Maria, it's very tempting even for me to try to put ordinary explanations to these phenomena. And sometimes there are. Sometimes there are hoaxes. I've come across those in this research. People that just invent stories. They even get other people to work with them. I don't know why they do this, but you could have a whole group of people creating a story to fool people to come to conferences. I've seen that happen. And of course, my mind, trained in the scientific tradition and social science, you think, are these urban legends? Is this folklore, modern folklore? But when you begin to see multiple witnesses come forward, very credible people, you basically realize that's just not an explanation for this. Sure, there can be folklore around it, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some very difficult to explain phenomena at the root of it. And by the time the Navy comes forward and says, it's so serious, we need to have classified briefings for senators and Congress people to try to alert them to the need for more research on these objects, then you realize it's a much bigger issue than you thought. Maybe the military isn't talking about it very much, but it's bugging them too. And that's why we don't think that most of these sightings are just drones. And another reason is, Maria, there's huge, the United States is a very big country. I don't know if you've ever visited here. There's huge areas that the military has where they can test these objects in secret. Area 51, the size of Rhode Island. There are areas you can test black budget technology in the US without anybody seeing it. So if you're really trying to protect it, well, why would you just fly it over mass areas? It doesn't quite make sense. So those of us that investigate that don't think that that's the full explanation. It could be part of it, no doubt, but we don't think it's the whole thing.
I was thinking about an electro car, placing that, well, early technology into, for instance, the 40s or in the 50s. I think people would see it like UFO technology or something that they are very, very afraid of. So, but I'm not trying to debunk it, and I'm just trying to, well, weigh everything and look at, just view it from different points of view. What if? What if? That is the biggest question.
No harm in doing that. The thing is, even technology like electric cars or something that would have seemed like UFOs to people 100 years ago, eventually those go into the public domain, right? They end up on the street. Even US military technology, stealth aircraft, 10, 15 years later, it's deployed in Libya. And you see these triangular-like planes flying around in the Libyan operation a number of years ago and so forth, early 90s. The thing about this technology, Maria, is 50, 60, 70 years later, we don't have anything in the public domain that's even remotely like what people have been reporting. That just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I can think of a couple of things, like, for instance, positive and negative cloaking. That is something, or hovering on electromagnetic fields that is addressing the electromagnetic fields of the Earth. But it's just me.
That might exist now. There isn't any doubt that governments around the world are working on cloaking technology. I mean, I read about this in Science magazine, but I'm talking about in the 1940s. In the 1950s, people saw large triangular craft in the 1930s in the United States. Who was flying those? The David Noble White Crow sighting I mentioned to you wasn't a small object. It was a very long cylindrical object that had a very strange blue plasma coming out of it. And based on
the pulsed plasma thrusters from NASA.
From who?
For instance. Full plasma thrusters. There's a kind of engine that is working on plasma.
We're talking about the 1960s, the early 1960s. Think about what was around in the 60s, the other technology we have. Is it really conceivable that technology 50 years later still isn't publicly known? It doesn't seem quite reasonable. And then we have another level of data, which is what people have said about it. David was able to talk to the officers on the ship. He was an artist like you are. He did sketches. And he told me that they would tell him when he would do these sketches for them, off the book, he would get scuttlebutt. In Navy language, scuttlebutt is kind of rumors that are going around the ship. He said that they would tell him that these were unidentifiable objects. They called them fireflies. And they said, we try to track them, but we don't know where they're from. So you have another level of information that confirms that it's not just secret technology. Now, again, that could be the explanation for some of these sightings, even a large case. But certainly there's a large chunk of those sightings that just don't seem to fit that category of classified black budget technology, especially when you get the objects landing, like I wrote about in Black Swan Ghosts, beings getting out of the ships in skin-tight suits, holding types of technology that people can identify. Who are those beings? I mean, who are they? Why are they landing in the middle of the night and contacting people?
I'm thinking of the biosuit that is also NASA, but like I said, I'm not trying to debunk it. I'm just asking this question: what if, and is it possible?
Yep. So I think in many cases that could be a possibility, but the NASA, you're not the first one to think of this. There were sightings of the Socorro incident in the 1960s where Lonnie Zamora saw an object, land in the desert, on the desert floor. He heard the sounds. He saw these small beings walking around it, and there were patterns on the side of the ship. And that was one explanation, that maybe this was a NASA test mission, but it just didn't coincide with any known NASA activity to this day. And 2 weeks later, the same ship and occupants were seen in France, in a field in France. But who was that in the 1960s flying around, 3-foot beings? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And I don't think conventional explanations, I think of these two, I just don't think they fit. That's my view on it.
Perhaps we have overlooked or forgotten during our so-called evolution that we have forgotten a couple of evolutions that are still there.
Yes.
For instance, there are still crocodiles who are dinosaurs, and that Bigfoot, for instance, is just forgotten evolution, but it's still there. So, and it doesn't want to be hunted, it doesn't want to be killed, so it's hiding. Some say that aliens, UFOs, remote viewing, crop circles among others, lies in the range of being the woo-woo stuff or pseudoscience. So, Simeon, how real are these phenomena which are taking place in the non-physical planes? I mean, except for what people have reported, what proof do we have that these events are truly taking place?
Well, you've mentioned a lot of topics, but I would say they're as real as the airplanes that fly overhead that you see. They are as real. As we said earlier in the interview, there are things called hidden events, events that witnesses don't want to talk about for a variety of reasons. And where you have hidden events, you have hidden history. And just like you're suggesting, there could be branches of evolution that even to this date we're not familiar with. We don't have proof that these objects are necessarily extraterrestrial. That's a big point of discussion. Certainly, one of the possibilities is that they are from the Earth They are here too. We just don't know about them. We don't realize that we share the planet with other intelligent beings. It's certainly not something you and I have ever been taught, but that could be one possibility. I believe it's called the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, is that there are other terrestrial beings here with us who may have been here before us, who we don't see very often. Maybe they
Never
live.
heard about that. I'm going to Google that for
But
sure.
you just suggested it with Bigfoot. Maybe there's other beings here with other abilities that have not yet been accepted. Any new topic is always ridiculed. Isn't what Einstein said? First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then it's accepted as self-evident truth. That woo-woo feeling you get from these topics is not a good indicator of whether it's true or not. As I mentioned, the people had that feeling about the Wright brothers. The articles at the time were flyers or liars. Well, they turned out to be flyers. No one could conceive of a lighter than aircraft floating in the air, even for a number of years after the Wright brothers. I know that Thomas Edison, the inventor of the phonograph, the first time he demonstrated the phonograph with a speaker, he was accused of being a ventriloquist. You know, someone that can project their voice?
Yeah.
There are very few scientific inventions, with the exception of Isaac Newton, rare exception, that were accepted in their day at the time. Even quantum mechanics, Maria, in the U.S. was grounds to accuse you of being a communist and bring you in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities for believing in quantum mechanics. Just down the road from me is the University of Colorado, where Edward Condon, the author of the Condon Report that ended Project Blue Book, the Air Force study of UFOs, he was brought in front of these House Un-American Activities committees for his belief in quantum mechanics. They thought
that sounds silly now, yeah.
but to them it was woo-woo, and they thought, if you believe in one woo-woo idea, don't you think it's possible you could believe in other woo-woo ideas like communism? So the woo-woo idea just doesn't hold, and everything seems like woo-woo when it's new. I read about this in science all the time. It's what we do. But how do we deal with it? We bring forth evidence, and we look at the weight of the evidence, and we decide, is there enough to take it seriously, to look at it and to examine it more? I think with all these topics, there's zero doubt, from Bigfoot through crop circles, through UFOs to RV. There's something there that there's enough physical evidence easily. With UFOs, there's thousands of trace cases where these objects leave impressions in the ground. That isn't something you can call woo anymore. I mean, the ground is a physical thing. When you see that the objects had to weigh many tons to push the dirt down, something landed there. Now, is the explanation easy? Not necessarily. I'm personally a fan of the Everett many worlds interpretation. He invented this in the 50s at Princeton, but that was not popular either. But many physicists now say that the way Everett looked at quantum mechanics is a simpler way to look at it. Parallel realities. Now, that's a whole other subject. But over time, Maria, you have to agree, thinking changes, ideas change. And it takes evidence like this. Initially, it's considered woo-woo, as you're saying, and eventually later on, it's just considered, everyone knows that. It's just obvious. And these topics are candidates for that process, simply based on the numbers of witnesses, I would say.
Do you think that science, or accepted science to say so, will find a possible proof for the existence of, well, let's call it like so, ETs, or that Bigfoot is truly existing, or that parallel worlds do exist? Do you think science will find proof or plausible proof soon?
Well, sometimes we have the proof, but we don't want to look at it. And it was Dean Radin the other day to you that mentioned meteorites. There was proof, but there wasn't the thinking to accept it at the time. And at the time, the French Academy of Sciences said that was just rocks, volcano stones. They called them volcano stones. They had to come, in their mind, they had to be ejected by volcanoes and fall on the ground, and that's where they, but that was wrong.
Yeah.
There was a guy who saw these new types of crystals, quasi-crystals. who was thrown out of the crystallographers union because they said there are no odd-sized crystals. They all have to be 2, 4, 6, 8, or something, some combination.
Yeah.
He turned out to be, I'm forgetting his name at the moment, Daniel something or other. He won the Nobel Prize for discovery of quasi-crystals. But at the time, he was thrown out of his own professional organization. All of these scientific discoveries, they're always controversial. And the people in power at the time always want to say that it's fringe science. They come up with names for it. What do they call it? Junk science. They come up with labels to discourage people from investigating. Cold fusion being the perfect example. Fleischmann and Pons discovered this in 1989. They weren't the first, but they talk about it. And other physicists and chemists are furious over this because they believe that it's impossible. But now, decades later, we've had hundreds of laboratories reproduce Fleischmann and Pons effects. It's now called something else, LENR, low energy nuclear reaction. But there's no doubt in my mind that it's a real phenomenon. I've heard people from very reputable institutions say they've reproduced cold fusion. So I think it's more the nature of the evolution of knowledge that it's controversial. There's often a lot of acrimonious debate. There's name calling. There's mudslinging. As Groucho Marx would say, I haven't seen this much mudslinging since the last election. That's what happens in science. It's ad hominem attacks. It's a nasty process. I mean, you have to have some real fortitude to be involved with this. People are going to use this to criticize you. Oh, you believe in this and that. But if you look at history of science, what ends up happening? A lot of these things, not every single one of them, but a lot of these end up turning out to be very true. It wasn't that there wasn't evidence, like you're saying. It was that the evidence wasn't accepted and they weren't allowed to publish. Or for any variety of reasons, there were political forces at work that made it unpopular for that particular. Look in the Soviet Union and China, how much political pressure there were. People who were non-physicalists, who were looking at alternative processes. There was a time when you had to believe in a certain view of quantum mechanics in the Soviet Union, or you weren't allowed to practice anymore.
Okay.
So it always can be very politicized, and the scientists who don't agree with that lose their jobs, and we don't hear from them again, but they could turn out to be right. Alternatively, the governments can accept the wrong type of science, and it can turn out years later that something could be very destructive or harmful, and we outlaw it later on. We used to add lead to gasoline. We don't do that anymore. But how long did it take to ban lead in gasoline? Like 100 years. Something like 80. A long time. So the process can be slow. And in the meantime, there can be a lot of conflict. We're having that debate right now about fluoridated water in the U.S. This is something I've never thought mattered. I've been studying for 15 years. The vast majority of the world does not fluoridate water. They rejected it because of the toxic effects, including the vast majority of Europe, with a couple areas in Spain and Northern Ireland, and a few places in the UK, a couple counties in the UK. Vast majority countries. I've talked to people from Europe. The scientists there said there's this toxic effects, so we're not putting this in water. But in the US, it's added to water. There's a case in front of the EPA in the federal court right now. Our EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has been taken to court by citizens groups that saying, why did you ignore such strong evidence that there's risk? If you bring the argument up for many years, they would call anyone that took this point of view that questioned fluoride, woo-woo, and it's conspiracy theory, junk science. But there's a lot of good studies. The people that came up with the results that said that fluoride could be dangerous were fired from their jobs. Phillips, Mullinex, and others, they were asked to, I'm just using this as an example. I don't want to dwell too long, but it's the same sort of thing. They were asked to look at the toxic effects of fluoride. They looked at animal studies, all sorts of things, time motion studies, looking at film of animals after they've been given a lot of fluoride. And they got ADD, we call this attention deficit disorder. And they said, this is dangerous. Look at these animals. Fired. You're gone. It's not. So there is a strong, in a modern society that we have, science is not as free as it used to be in some ways. You have to rely on big funding agencies. You need to rely on the federal government. And people that offend those agencies don't get the funding. So it's a very long-winded answer to your question, Maria. It's not just evidence, it's politics. And I think you know about this.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. It is indeed, we should indeed cheer open-minded scientists, researchers, students, and reduce the narrow mind or narrow thinking a bit more. But Simeon, I see we are way past the hour.
We're way past there.
and therefore, I'd like to thank you for talking with you about these fascinating topics about remote viewing and crop circles, who made them, and what is the mystery behind the geometric designs. But before we close out, can you tell us where we can find more information on your books, the research that you have conducted, and your online remote viewing classes, and where people can contact you if they have questions?
Yeah, sure. I have a blog where I put up all my YouTube videos. I do have a YouTube channel. They can search for my name on YouTube. I'm active on Twitter. I have a blog called New Crystal Mind, where people can look at some of the things I do. They can contact me. I teach classes in RV. We have one coming up in January. I do them all the time, just as of this broadcast. If you'd like to let people know, I have a 2-day class. It is on American time zones, so it might be difficult for people in other countries to attend it live. But that's at learnrv.org. So you can go to newcrystalmind.com or learnrv.org to learn about the RV. And I have free mini classes. I encourage you to try this. You can go there and just take a little of this training, and I have a practice target on video where I walk you through, and you can see what it's like for yourself. Listen, can I say one thing here? I don't encourage anybody to believe anything I say. Believe your own experience, but be fair about it. If you don't think RV is possible, try it for yourself. Don't believe me. Get some friend to put a picture in a folder and see how much you can describe. Or if you want a little training, take my little free class. I have some online training that takes a couple of weeks to go through too. Try it for yourself. All these topics, you should believe your own experience over what other people say, including me or even you. Believe your own experience. Try it for yourself. The main thing is don't have fear about these topics. Investigate it. Talk to people. Try it for yourself and come to your own conclusion. That's what I would say.
Thank you all for tuning in this week on The Next Truth, where science and myth meet. Make sure to visit our website, www.nexttruth.com. That is nexttruth, all in one word.com. And let us know what you think about our podcast. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we would appreciate a rating on our website in the section The Next Truth Podcasts. Or if you would simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us too. I am Maria Anna van Driel with The Next Truth. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.